Welcome to this video training on how to use Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection's Lead and Copper Rule Revision Service Line Inventory Excel template. To access the Service Line Inventory Excel template, always go to DEP's Lead and Copper Rule Revision, or LCRR for short, website for the latest template. The website is linked in the video description. Another easy way to get to the website is to use your favorite search engine and type PA DEP LCRR. To download the template, click on the link. After it has been saved to your computer, DEP recommends renaming the file using your own naming convention. You should also download the DEP Service Line Inventory Excel template job aid, as it summarizes the material covered in this training video. Due to the features and macros used by the Excel template, you must have Microsoft Excel 2013 or newer for the template to work properly. Depending upon your security settings, when you first open the Excel template, you will have to enable the macros. Do this by clicking the Enable Content button. When you first open the Excel template, you are on the Instructions tab. Each tab is its own Excel worksheet or page. The tab that you are in currently will show in white. We are on the Introduction tab, so that tab is white. The Excel workbook is made up of several worksheets. A key to navigating within the spreadsheet is to use the tabs at the bottom. The worksheet tabs are organized by color. There are 4 tabs that are yellow: Introduction, Instructions, Class and Tier Information, and Reg Questions and Answers. These worksheet tabs are all informational tabs for you to review, but you will not input any information on the yellow tabs. The blue tabs are where you will input your system-specific information, including the inventory. There is also a red tab that provides a summary of the information you have entered. Now, let's look at the different worksheets in more detail. The first tab is called Introduction. You can see that it gives an explanation of the layout of the workbook like we just went over. The second tab is called Instructions. This has detailed instructions, and in fact, the other spreadsheets link to the instructions at certain places, kind of like clicking a help button. You will see this in action later in the tutorial. The third tab, also yellow for reference, is called Class and Tier Information. You will see in this tutorial how the spreadsheet classifies each service line for you, but this tab explains the basis for the different classifications. And the last reference tab is the Reg Questions and Answers, which includes common regulatory-based questions and the federal citations for the different components of the service line inventory requirements. Let's look at the System Input tabs, starting with the General Information tab. As the name implies, this is the general information about your water system. You should start with this tab because some of the information is carried through and used by the macros in the detailed inventory. You can see that we already put in an example system called ABC, and they serve 4,000 people. You might notice that the number of service connections is a white field, meaning you cannot edit this field. The number of connections is pulled from the detailed inventory based on the number of service lines you input. So this provides a cross-check to see if you have entered all of your service lines. Don't worry about accidentally overwriting an auto-calculated cell, as these cells are protected and you will get the pop-up warning that just displayed on the screen. Scroll down and you can see that this tab asks for the physical and mailing addresses of the system, who the contact person is, and who prepared the report if they are different from the contact. The last piece of information asked is how the system will make the service line inventory information available to the public. In the Inventory Methods tab, you are asked to indicate the methods used to identify the service line materials. Part 1 is for Historic Records Review. Take note of the far right column called Level of Confidence. The drop-down gives you the options of high, medium, or low confidence in the particular record type. For example, number 3 is for water system records, such as tap cards and meter installation records. Maybe you have tap cards that aren't very visible because they were in a flood or they are faded with age, so you would indicate that you have low confidence in these records. The idea is that this should tip you off to try and find other verifications for these records, maybe additional records such as as-built drawings. The rest of this tab asks about all the methods used to create the service line inventory. Part 2 is for identifying lines during normal operations, and Part 3 is for specific service line investigations. Before we move to the Detailed Inventory tab, we need to first define service line. Under the lead and copper rule, the service line is a line that connects the water main to the building inlet that may be owned by the water system, the property owner, or both. Joint ownership is the most common in Pennsylvania. And now let's look at the Detailed Inventory tab. As the name implies, this is where you will enter the detailed information for each service line. It may look overwhelming at first, but let's step through it. First, all data entry will happen in row 7, beginning in column E. As you can see, as I scroll over, the inventory is very long horizontally. Here's a diagram to show you how the spreadsheet is laid out. You can see that the diagram shows the system side and the customer side of a service line, which is typical in Pennsylvania. At the top, we have a snippet of the yellow headings from the spreadsheet. This represents how the yellow cells cover the overall service line information. Then, looking below, the columns in peach color will cover the system side information, while the cells in pink will cover the customer portion. Now, let's go back to the detailed inventory. We did not show this in the diagram, but at the beginning of the sheet are 3 bright green columns. This is the smart aspect of the spreadsheet. You cannot enter anything here. Instead, the spreadsheet will determine the service line classification, which could be lead, galvanized requiring replacement, non-lead, or lead status unknown. You can also see that it will tell you if you have sufficient evidence for non-lead, which we'll talk about in depth later in this tutorial. Additionally, these green columns tell you the sampling tier. To demonstrate the spreadsheet, we will use a system that has a full copper service line. As shown here, the system side was replaced with copper in 2004, and the customer side is still the originally installed copper from 1975. Let's see how this is captured in the spreadsheet. The first step is to create a unique service line ID for the service line. It is important that this ID never changes, as it will always be associated with this service line. To find out the requirements for the ID, let's use the help instructions. You will notice a lot of the headers in the spreadsheet are underlined and in blue, like hyperlinks on a typical web page. In the template, these links take you to the instructions for each header. You can see here that the instructions give the parameters for the unique ID. For example, it can be up to 30 characters, but can't have any spaces or special characters. After you are done with the help, click on the Return to Form, and it takes you back to the detailed inventory at the same data field. For the unique ID in our example, I'm going to use a street address with no spaces. In the next column, the record type is initial since it's the initial inventory under LCRR. This is a good time to point out the drop-down menus. Many of the cells in the spreadsheet are set up this way. You will see a default answer, such as initial in this case. Click into the cell and a drop-down will appear for your choices. The small drop-down arrow does not appear until you click into the cell. Date replacement completed does not apply to the initial inventory. The options for ownership type are joint, customer-owned, or system-owned. For our example, we will leave it as joint, which is typical in Pennsylvania. Put the service line address in the next series of columns. Street address 1 for our example is 101 Main Street, and the city and zip code for our example is your town and 17111. Moving over to school and child care facility. These are asking if the service is connected to either of these facilities. This is not a required part of the inventory, but it is a good idea to track this now because it will affect sampling later. In our example, we will leave both as no. Now we get to the peach columns, which is the information for the system-owned portion, as you can see represented in our diagram. Typically, this portion is the main to the curb stop. First, select the type of material from the drop-down. You can see here all the types, including lead, different plastic types, galvanized, and unknown. You can have unknown lines in this initial inventory. For our example, we are going to select copper. Before continuing with the system-owned portion of the spreadsheet, we will discuss the terms upstream and downstream. For the purposes of the inventory, we are only talking about upstream and downstream on the service line and not the main. The term upstream refers to anything on the service line in the system before the reference point, while the term downstream refers to anything on the service line in the system after the reference point. Let's look at the example on screen. We will use the curb stop as the reference point. For our example, the portion of the service line that is highlighted would be considered upstream of the curb stop, while the meter is considered downstream of the curb stop. Next, the spreadsheet asks if the material was ever previously lead, which is essentially asking if it was a lead line, but it was replaced at some point. You will notice that you can select yes, no, or not sure. The next column asks if there is a lead pigtail, gooseneck, or connector upstream. Upstream means upstream on the service line. So, for the system-owned side, it would be a lead connector at the main going to the service line. A lead pigtail, gooseneck, or connector does not make it a lead line. Lead at the main comes into play if the line downstream is galvanized. The spreadsheet will then categorize the line as galvanized, requiring replacement because of the effect of the lead on the galvanized pipe. For our example, I will put no for both columns. The next column is installation date range. These go in 10-year increments. Remember, for our example, the copper pipe on the system side was replaced in 2004, so we will select 2001 to 2010. The next column is for the specific date, if it is known. We have records that show the copper line was installed on November 1st, 2004. Then there is a column for pipe diameter. Our example has a diameter of 2 inches. The next 4 columns in the spreadsheet deal with the methods the water system used to determine the pipe material. You can see we have basis of material classification non-field twice, field method, and date of verification. These fields are used to determine if you have sufficient evidence to verify the material of the service line. This is of particular importance when you select a non-lead material such as copper. You need to show sufficient evidence that the material is non-lead and therefore safe and not slated for lead service line replacement. DEP has information on what constitutes sufficient evidence for the non-lead designation, including a job aid document which is linked in the description below and on the DEP LCRR website. Depending on what you enter as the basis of material classification, the spreadsheet in column B will indicate if you have sufficient evidence for non-lead. We will show how this works in our example. Our example system has records that indicate that the system side of the service line was replaced in 2004 with copper. So, for the basis of material classification non-field method, we use the drop-down to indicate Records Review. Since this was installed after the 1991 Pennsylvania lead ban, the records alone are enough evidence to verify that this material is non-lead. This information is in the Sufficient Evidence for Non-Lead Job Aid linked in the description. If we look to column A in green for classification, it says to answer the customer questions, and for column B, Sufficient Evidence for Non-Lead, it says not applicable. This is because we have only answered questions so far for the system side and not the customer side. Now let's continue across the spreadsheet to the customer-owned portion questions. For this side, we have records indicating that the copper line was installed in 1975. For lines installed prior to the 1991 Pennsylvania lead ban, we need to verify the record with a second method. Again, you can use the Sufficient Evidence for Non-Lead Job Aid for more information. Our example system conducted a visual inspection inside the basement of the house where the service line enters the structure and verified that the line is copper. Let's see how all this is indicated in the spreadsheet. Here we have the portion of the spreadsheet for the customer-owned portion of the service line. Since our example is copper, we will select copper as the material. Next, the records show that there is not any type of lead connector, so we will select No for lead pigtail. We know that the installation date was 1975, so the installation date range is 1971 to 1980. From the records, the specific date was November 1st, 1975. If you do not know the exact date, you can simply place the year here. However, this is not a required field, so it could be left blank. Our example system has records of this service line, so the first basis of material classification is records review. Notice when I select this, it changes to No in red in column B, Sufficient Evidence for Non-Lead. Since the line was installed in 1975, records alone are not enough evidence to verify it is non-lead. We said for our example that they also conducted a visual inspection inside the home to verify the copper pipe entering the basement. For the drop-down menu in the basis of material classification field method, select E, Visual Inspection at Existing Access Point. Now, column B switches to Yes for Sufficient Evidence of Non-Lead. If you are ever completing the information for a service line and sufficient evidence stays on No, you are not properly fulfilling the method requirements. You can check the Sufficient Evidence for Non-Lead Job Aid. In column AG, you need to enter a date of field verification if you conducted a field analysis. For our example, the system conducted the visual inspection in the home on November 1st, 2021. The last part of the spreadsheet is for information on tap monitoring tiering under the lead and copper rule revisions. In column AI, using the drop-down, you indicate what type of unit the service line is connected to. For our example, we will select single-family residence. The next column is called POE Treatment Present. POE stands for Point of Entry Treatment at the residence or building. For our example, we will select No. The next column asks if there is lead solder in the interior plumbing. You may not know, and you can click Not Sure in the drop-down. Finally, the last column asks if this is currently an LCRR sampling site. For our example, we will put No. If you look over to column C, you can see that the spreadsheet has assigned a Tier 5 sampling tier. This does not change any of your current LCRR monitoring and is only being identified for future use. Finally, we are ready to click the Add to Inventory button. All the data entry happens in row 7, and then when you click Add to Inventory, error checks are run and it places the data into the rows starting with row 9. You can see that the service line information is displayed as the top row in the data below the data entry line. In this example, we already have some other service lines entered. You cannot edit any lines in the lower table, but you can easily pull up a service line for editing by typing the unique ID in the unique ID space, column E, row 7, and hitting Enter. You can then edit the information for this service line, and when you are done, click Add to Inventory again to save your changes to the inventory. You can also use this technique to add service lines that are very similar to a line you've already entered. For example, a residential neighborhood. simply enter the unique ID of a line you've already added, pull it up, and then change the unique ID and address for the service line you are adding. Now, let's look at an example of an error message you may receive when trying to add a service line. To show this, I'm going to pull up the 121 main service line and delete the date of field verification in column X. When I do this and then click Add to Inventory, a pop-up message appears. When I click OK, a detailed error message appears, including the column that is missing data and the proper format for entry. After the date is properly added and you click the Add to Inventory button again, the line will be added to the data properly. As you are working on the inventory, remember to save your work in the Excel workbook. You will be asked to submit your completed initial inventory to DEP prior to the October 16, 2024 deadline. This inventory must include all the service lines in your system, even if the material is identified as unknown. After the inventory is final, use the Export All to CSV button at the top of the Detailed Inventory tab to create the export files. A folder called PA_SLI will be created on your desktop, and the export files will be placed inside the folder. 3 export files will be created with General, Methods, and Detail appended to the file name. Each export file will be date stamped using the year, month, day format. The date stamp appears at the beginning of the file name so that the export files will automatically sort by date. DEP is creating a CSV file upload process. Check the LCRR website for more information on uploading your CSV files to DEP. Thank you for watching this video training on how to use Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection's Lead and Copper Rule Revision Service Line Inventory Excel template. For additional assistance on the Service Line Inventory Excel template, please contact the Bureau of Safe Drinking Water at 717-772-4018 or at ra-padwis@pa.gov.